Tonight, Chief Justice David Maraga has advised President Uhuru Kenyatta to dissolve Parliament for failing to enact the two-thirds gender law. National Assembly Speaker Justin Muturi has fired back at the CJ, saying the advisory is unrealistic. The Teacher Service Commission has ordered both primary and secondary school teachers to report back to learning institutions by September 28th ahead of the eventual reopening of schools. The ministry continues, however, to remain tight-lipped on the exact reopening date. We are all hustlers. Raila and Ruto continue throwing jabs at each other. Good evening and welcome to Pundits Night. I am Abubakar Abdullahi. Thank you as always for making time for us. Your voice as a viewer matters. Send us a message on 22047. The hashtag to use is Pundits Night. Let me introduce my guests tonight. Antonio Oluoch, who is the Mathare lawmaker. Herman Manyora is our resident analyst. Let's get into the discussion. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for making time for us tonight.
Good evening, Chu.
Good evening, good evening.
Good evening.
All right, let's start with the latest in as far as the shapings of the country's decisions and politics is concerned, and talk of the advisory that the Chief Justice David Maraga tonight is giving President Uhuru Kenyatta. First, Mheshimiwa Anthony Oluoch, let me start with you. Is it a case of an unconstitutional house tonight?
No, the house was properly constituted. First, thank you very much for having me on the show, and nice to see you, Professor Herman Manyora. The House was properly constituted when we took the oath of office shortly after the 2017 general elections, and it has been operating as such. It is properly constituted and anchored under the Constitution. But secondly, as to whether it has breached the Constitution in respect of things it ought to have done, that is the import of the advisory by the Chief Justice to the President. I don't want to rehash the background because it's all out there, but invoking Article 261, the Chief Justice seems to be suggesting that all the avenues available to him, including the Supreme Court advisory, the various court decisions, the opportunities that Parliament has been given in order to try and act have not been able to be done, and the days of that the time frame that was given, and which really ought to have been done in the last Parliament, is that it ought to have been enacted within 5 years of the enactment of the 2010 Constitution. So to the extent of those provisions as he has cited them as they are in the Constitution, we could say that Parliament has run afoul of the Constitution, is not improperly constituted as such, but has not put in place laws that the Constitution itself said that it should put.
Mheshimiwa, you say Parliament has run. You say, Mheshimiwa, Parliament has run foul. Is it not a violation of Article 81 of Kenya's 2010 Constitution, which says, and I quote, "Not more than two-thirds of the members of the elective public bodies shall be of the same gender"?
Yes, but remember that that same Constitution also says, it's a schedule that has been cited by the Chief Justice, that Parliament shall put in place legislation to put into effect or to give effect to those provisions. So Parliament has not done that, and until such a time that that law is in place and the formula as to how you arrive at these two-thirds is arrived at, then you cannot say that the Parliament is improperly constituted. We need a formula, and that formula was supposed to be put into place by legislation, and unfortunately, that legislation is not in place at the time.
We are more than a decade tonight since Kenya promulgated the 2010 Constitution. Mheshimiwa, why has Parliament then failed to bring that legislation?
Parliament has not failed. Parliament has tried. It is not for want of trying. I'm sure Herman, the Chief Justice, will be saying that the Constitution does not say try, it says enact, and it uses the word shall. But in the 11th Parliament and in the 12th Parliament, Parliament has tried twice to bring the two-thirds gender rule, and I remember in the parliament session that I am in, the majority leader then, Adan Duale, brought in a law to put this into effect. And Parliament, in his wisdom or the lack of it, shot down the piece of legislation. But remember also that CIOC, which is chaired by Jeremiah Kioni, and which is a committee in which I sit, has brought through the Constitution Implementation Oversight Committee a piece of legislation under Article 100 of the Constitution. And that legislation came through Parliament, it passed through the National Assembly, and was sent to the President. So in my view, in terms of Article 81 of past legislation, Parliament, the National Assembly, passed the legislation. Whether that legislation has been enacted, assented to, or gone through the Senate and the motion, that's a different thing.
All right, let me bring Herman to the discussion. Herman Manyora is our resident analyst. Herman, good evening. The Speaker of the National Assembly says, and I quote his words, the clamor for the dissolution of the current parliament on account of failure to enact the 2/3 gender legislation is at the very least rather unrealistic. It's not unrealistic, isn't it? Or is it, according to you, Herman?
I think I would agree with Speaker Muturi. It's unrealistic. The reason why Parliament has not enacted this law is simply because it's too tricky. It is just too difficult.
What makes it difficult, Herman?
If you intend, you know, look here, people elect their members of Parliament. What formula can you put in place other than the nomination in a manner that it is done at the county assembly? You see, at the county assembly after elections, you count the women in any county assembly. Now, if they do not meet the 2/3 gender rule, you then nominate to top up. Now, Speaker Muturi says if you are to do that to the National Assembly, to Parliament, I think the entire Parliament perhaps, you need 100 women to be nominated. You can see how tricky it is. The other option would be to force political parties to nominate women in their strongholds. Meaning, if ODM nominated a woman anywhere in Shire, she would win. You see that how difficult it is. It then goes down at the core of the rights of the individual to vote in the people they want to vote in. You now be forcing people. So it's not as easy as that. And therefore, we must understand this from that perspective, that is not easy. Secondly, it is unrealistic because if you ask the president to dissolve Parliament, the question you must deal with is this: will the president oblige you? Will he dissolve Parliament? I have seen people talking about shall as being mandatory. Indeed it is, but does not tell the president when to dissolve Parliament.
But Herman, just on the specifics of shall, and there is a varied legal interpretation of what this means in as far as Article 261 is concerned. The Constitution says the Chief Justice shall advise the President to dissolve the Parliament, and the President again shall dissolve Parliament.
No dispute there. I have not disputed. That's how it is.
Which means it is mandatory for the president to dissolve the National Assembly.
Yes, but the question then remains when. The head of state is not just head of government. He has to put many factors into consideration. Let's say we were in the thick of this pandemic. Okay, we are happy and lucky it's going down. But supposing we are in the thick of this and nobody knew exactly when it would end, will you order an election? If you dissolve Parliament today, I've heard some people saying minimum 14 days, maximum 21. Let me tell those people they are wrong. When the Constitution desires that there be a specific time frame, it puts that time there. When the Constitution says the President will assent to a law, it puts a time frame. When the Constitution wants a petition against the election of president, it puts there 14 days. You can go on and on. There are many instances in the Constitution where the Constitution provides the time frame. How would it have failed to provide for the time frame in such a sensitive matter? Look, when the framers of the Constitution wanted 2/3 implemented in the county assembly, they provided for it in an express manner. Why did they leave it like this for the National Assembly and Senate? National Assembly. It is tricky. It is difficult. I think the Chief Justice, in my view, the Chief Justice did not take sufficient factors into consideration. Like if you dissolve Parliament today, there are so many things that can go wrong. You have to look into all those things. In fact, how do we go about organizing for an election?
All right, Haman, let me pose this question to Mathare Lomeka and Anthony Olwoch. Okay, fine. Mheshimiwa, shall, the interpretation continues to vary, but is it a case of a time-free decision then?
Let me make this to my issues of shall, because I'm sure that the court have interpreted time without number. The interpretation is according to the word shall. But having said that, I want to speak to the question of the difficulty. And I've had the occasion to speak to members of the former committee of experts in relations to circumstances in which article was crafted. And it's one of those things that committee of experts and members of parliament would not agree on. And some of those issues have been touched on by Haman. When you put in a piece of legislation, a provision in the Constitution that says no two-thirds, and you don't provide the similar elaborate procedures that were given to the council and Article 177. You can see the very elaborate procedure under 177. It talks about the alternate manner in which this thing ought to be done, male, female, and it becomes much easier than you see in Article 81. The second difficulty I see, other than the ones that have been adverted to by the Speaker, is that affirmative action is an intervention that is supposed to be time-bound. It cannot be a permanent fixture in the Constitution, because you can see under 81B, there is the reference, and the Constitution defers to the exercise of the rights of the citizens under Article 38, the freedom to choose. And this cannot be circumscribed in perpetuity. An affirmative action is an intervention, and it has a sunset clause. And remember, this is one of the reasons that the Duale collapsed, because members of parliament argued that if we effect this legislation over a period of time, you need to be able to say that after 10 years, the circumstances in which our women folk find themselves may have changed, and they have come into equal position with the male folks, or vice versa, and we can now lift it so that people are able to compete effectively. So remember that the basic tenet of our democracy is anchored under 38. The 81 one becomes, in my view, secondary exercise of that under 38. So you must forever and continually look at a situation in which you safeguard the right of the individual citizen to make a choice without telling them bring X number of people into parliament. The third and the last difficulty that I see, and I want to draw the parallel from the provision of the Constitution that has to accept or to judges from a name or list of names provided by the Judicial Service Committee. The Constitution says so, but it didn't say what will you do to the president in the event that he does not. And this is what I see also in Article 261(7). And remember the immunities that the president enjoys. While you can dissolve parliament, what will you do with the president if under Article 261(7) the president fails to act on the word shall?
Mheshimiwa, you have insisted on the choice at an individual level and letting people choose and not restricting them. These are the very same people who chose and passed this constitution, which had a law as such. Nonetheless, before you answer that, let me bring Haman to the discussion. Haman, then, is this not an affront to the women of this country in terms of leadership and representation, understanding that the genesis of this law was to create at least fairness in politics and representation?
You know, we in this part of the world, we are people who allow busybodies to control us. And if you look at our constitution, Abubakar, there is so much NGO and civil society in it, pushing us into things that we never even gave serious thought to. You see, when you have women being half of the population, sometimes even more, you cannot leave them in affairs of the state, including decision making. That is a fact. But
why can't you leave them to make decisions, Herman? That's pretty preposterous, isn't it?
No, you did not get what I'm saying. I'm saying it will be unrealistic for a society to leave a significant portion of that society out of affairs of that society.
Fair enough.
So women must be involved. But we must not rush things. In fact, it should be incremental. As society develops, there are certain things you could have forced people to do in the 1960s, like take your girl to school. Whoever talks about that anymore? Anybody like me, if I have property, I don't have property, and I have boys and girls, I don't need to be told by any law to share my property. Some things go with the time. So look here, we are at a state in our country where we need the best men and women to move this country forward. Kenya is a plane. We want the best pilot. And this idea of women, this idea of regions, this idea that we have a Kikuyu here in this job, and therefore we must also have a Luo here, and a Doromo here, and a Griama there, and a Kamba there. We shouldn't go in that direction. Because when you are wheeled into a theater, Abubakar, you just want the best surgeon to work on you. This country is not at that stage where we should bring all these things into consideration. We must encourage our girls to go to school, and we are doing it. There are many counties in this country, when results are released, you realize there are more girls than boys in schools, including my own county. There are more girls in primary schools in my county than there are boys. That's encouraging. We must remove all obstacles that prevent girls from going to school, doing well. They must be promoted at their places of work. We must encourage them and support them and facilitate them.
And Herman, part of that encouragement, part of that encouragement to some is have fairness in the 2/3 gender rule. It doesn't extend there?
Not that way. That's not the way to go. I have said there are so many obstacles. If you want to run for an election, ask Mother Karua, ask Charity Ngilu, ask Millie Odhiambo, ask these women who have been elected to go to parliament, to get elected as an MCA, a senator, a governor, as a woman. The challenges are enormous. Those we can remove, we have to remove. For example, hooliganism. You know, societal biases and cultural biases. We must try to remove those ones. Challenges of finances, where money is everything. We must do legislation to make money a reasonable resource, not everything. So that we now enable our women to participate in elections, but not to give them. And if we must give them, not in the numbers we would end up giving them. Imagine we have a parliament of 450 people. 450 in a population of less than 50 million people. Then we nominate another 100 women. My friend, we are jokers. Then we go begging. Then people are dying of hunger in Turkana. Then we go borrowing left, right, and we are nominating 100 women. We love them. They are our mothers, they are our sisters, they are our wives. But let them struggle. We shall give them support as we push. If my wife wanted to stand for election, I'll support her fully. But let's not just over-nominate women because of the truth.
All right, let me bring Mheshimiwa Anthony to the discussion. Is it then a case of the proverbial difficulties in the politics that is becoming difficult for women?
I think one of the problems that I have noticed about this discussion on the 2/3 gender rule is the characterization of gender to be equal to women. And looking at part of the reason that the male folk may have shot this down was the approach that was given of the we versus them, that gender in the Constitution and gender in relation to seats refers to giving seats to women. The gender issue as crafted under Article 27 refers to either gender. So that
Yes.
let's begin from there, that it is something that really ought to be a question of both male and female and not about women themselves as such. It is a human rights issue and it is not necessarily a women's issue. And I think that's a big mistake that we have been able to import into this thing, so that then you have also then brought with it the baggage of the patrilineal or patriarchal or male chauvinistic attitudes that have bedeviled these questions of two-thirds gender rule. So I think the orientation and the ideology around it has wrongly been characterized, and I think largely by the women leadership in this country, as a women's issue. So then now you close out any possibility of anybody like Anthony, who otherwise is supportive of the gender issue, and especially carrying on our women folk so that they are equal to the male folk in elective representation. My second point is that the Constitution itself at Article 81 puts this country on the wrong footing on how we can address the issues of gender. And we had tried in Article 100, the bill by on promotion of representation of marginalized groups, to try and recalibrate this so that gender representation should not be restricted, as is done in Article 81B, to elective positions. Remember that the elective positions in this country, if you add all those parliament and the Senate and the National Assembly, does not exceed 450. But we have the government that controls the cabinet, we have principal secretaries, we have chairs of constitutional commissions, we have parastatals, we have boards. In the same way that we look at the issue of ethnicity, that ought to be looked at in the totality of all the institutions that we have, and how do we put people so that we put the face of Kenya, is the same way that we must look at the issue of gender. And I think that is the opportunity that we must seize, and which I hope that the BBI was going to do. So that I had hoped that the Chief Justice perhaps have given a little window. He has waited 2 years and 6 petitions or so down the line.
Yes.
He could have waited 3 months to see what the BBI is, because I know for a fact that the two-thirds gender rule, there is an attempt to solve it there. And one of the ways that it attempts to solve it, I hope, would be to try and put back the obligation on the political parties at the time in which they nominate. And remember that the political parties are institutions of governance and they are funded by me, so that they try to solve this issue by putting a zigzag nomination. If the first nominee in the list that you take to Parliament of the people after your nomination is a male, then the second one would be a female. If you have 100 people that you forward, then half of it, or at least 40, become part of it. The second incentive among the legislations that I would have hoped that we would be able to look at is to put the political party fund and say that parties which attempt or go out of their way to try and equalize gender in terms of their nomination will have a certain portion of money of the political party's fund that is given to them. But that is just on the elective. We must remember that the government controls nearly 82% of the budget that we appropriate from the National Assembly. 82% of a 3 trillion budget is a lot of money, and with it a lot of positions in the non-elective positions in government where we ought to be looking. So we are looking again to the National Assembly the same way we are always looking at the 10 or 15% controlled by the judiciary and parliament, while 85 or 82% of the resources of this country are wasted and are controlled by the. So we need to expand.
All right, Mheshimiwa, yes. Fair enough. You have made your point. Nonetheless, there is a question here on 22047 that I want you to answer. And someone who has not mentioned his or her name is asking, what happens if the president fails the parliament?
I don't know. If the president cannot fail parliament, maybe he will fail the chief justice or the people.
I think that is supposedly what this viewer meant.
The petition was not filed by parliament.
Yes.
The referral was not made by parliament. It's made by the chief justice. So I believe what the viewer is asking is that
if the president does. The chief justice has advised him to dissolve parliament. If he does not follow, what happens?
If he does not follow, that's a question I raised earlier, that the people who framed this, you remember there are a number of things where we had a quagmire and people couldn't agree, and that's why in Naivasha we ended up with a presidential system, when initially what was in the bomber's draft was actually a parliamentary system. The 2/3 gender rule was one such thing. So it was thrown here as one of those things that let us pass this constitution, whoever it is will be able to deal with it. In Article 261(7), it just says that the Chief Justice shall advise. Once he advises and the President receives the advice to dissolve, he fails to dissolve, the next article does not tell you what to do with the President. It just says if Parliament has been dissolved, under the clause, a new Parliament shall enact the required legislation. But in between, assuming the Parliament is not dissolved, then now you cannot go back to the Chief Justice, you cannot go back to Parliament, you simply must face the President and either impeach him, and for you to impeach the President, you need to bring a motion of impeachment to the very Parliament that you needed to dissolve.
Mheshimiwa, you paint a picture of a legal quagmire. Nonetheless, let me bring Herman to the discussion because I really want us to move away from this.
Herman, I think that was put
Abu Bakr.
Yes.
Abu Bakr. It is possible that the person who asked the question meant exactly that the president could fail Parliament. How? Parliament does not expect the president to dissolve Parliament. They don't. And he could fail them by dissolving Parliament. Under what circumstances would the president dissolve Parliament? He would only dissolve Parliament if it serves his interests. He's a politician. People have brought all manner of scenarios that if he dissolves Parliament, then this happens, he could extend his term, and so on and so forth. If there is an opening for him to benefit in whichever way, then he could dissolve Parliament and he could fail Parliament. Are we together?
Yes.
But to your question, Article 261(7) advise the president dissolves Parliament. Up to there, I say there's no problem. It does not say when. And I was telling you, the question of when is critical. Is critical. The president can tomorrow say, ladies and gentlemen, I have received this petition, I'm looking at it, I will dissolve Parliament. I will dissolve Parliament. I shall, if you wish, dissolve Parliament. Then he goes back to State House. At what point will you go to him to ask him why, when he's dissolving, why he hasn't done it so far? I had some very senior lawyer saying, like I said before, 14 days minimum, 21 days. In fact, they went ahead to say that effective today, anything that Parliament does is unconstitutional, is null and void, ab initio, with all those Latin words. Look here, my friend. The Constitution would have said as much. The matter of dissolving the National Assembly and Senate or Parliament is not a simple matter. You can't leave it to chance. You can't leave it to the whims of the president to dissolve Parliament when he wins, when he wishes to. They would have stated, and like all watching Mheshimiwa says, they would also have stated what would happen in the event he didn't dissolve Parliament. The Constitution didn't, because the Constitution knew this is not anything anybody will handle. And they managed to handle it at the county assembly level under Article 1, I think 77. So you get it. And I'm sure the president will not dissolve Parliament, because a general election is a very elaborate exercise. It has serious timelines. It has serious administrative and legal challenges. You cannot just walk into a general election in the next 3 or 4 months if you dissolve Parliament today. You might need like 6 to 9 months to prepare. Tell me what would happen in the country without a parliament. Does the Constitution talk about that? That in the event the National Assembly, the Senate are at home, they are no longer constituted, the president is running the country alone. How do we make laws? How do we pass laws regarding monies? Look, there are so many things that parliament, you can't do without laws. There are so many things you can't do without parliament.
All right,
including the budget process. The Constitution has not talked about that.
All right, Mheshimiwa Anthony, you want to react to that?
Just to add to what Herman has said, Article 261 ought to have had a clause similar to that is at Article 115.6. Article 115.6 refers to the power of the president to assent, so that when a bill has gone through the processes and sent to the president by the speaker, the president will assent to it within a period prescribed under clause 1, which is 14 days. But then it goes on to say that if the president shall not have assented to it on the expiry, it becomes law. So the Constitution actually knew that it ought to place timelines on the president and say that if within 14 days the president, or 30 days, he has not dissolved parliament, parliament shall stand dissolved. But it didn't. And I think this was very deliberate.
All right,
deliberate.
All right, gentlemen, we have talked of the dissolution of the parliament. Quickly, I want us to talk about education matters. Today, the Teacher Service Commission, which is the employer of teachers, asked teachers to start reporting back to schools. Herman, is it the right time perhaps to reopen schools now?
We can borrow from what has happened elsewhere. Countries that have tried to reopen schools have quickly had to close the schools because of what happens in one place, 177 infections in a day. We know how panic controls this country. Let's just assume, and God forgive, we open schools in October, as I'm sure Magoha wants to do. We open then Mukumu Girls High School, 5 cases. Alliance Girls High School, 3 cases. Shimolatewa, 2 cases. You know Kenyans. The way they will be rushed to bring children out of those schools. And let me tell people this. If by bad luck we are hit by a second wave or something close to that, and there are infections in our schools, and we close because of that, let Magoha hear this. I hope somebody hears and tells him this, and the President Uhuru Kenyatta. When you will try to reopen next year, you will have a lot of persuading to do. In South Africa, parents didn't want to take their children to school. They told the president, Ramaphosa, open the bus first. Let us test it on ourselves. Let's go and drink in the shabeens. They call them their bus like that. If we don't die, then bring our kids to school. Let me tell you what's happening, Abubakar. There are people who are pushing government, and their sole motivation is money. They are private schools. There are rich Kenyans who want their children to go to proceed. Because while poor Kenyans have had their children at home, the rich, those in private schools, and even other rich people, their children have continued to learn. That is a fact. You rush them through this process.
Herman, let me interject you at that point. You say there are people who are pushing the government or the Ministry of Education?
Yes, to reopen schools. Yes, it's not a secret.
Why would they push the ministry to reopen schools, Herman?
I have said private schools, that is business. I am saying people have eaten COVID money through KEMSA. They want to eat through schools when they reopen. There will be a lot of government intervention, beginning with the money for the desks. There is going to be money for masks. The people who stole at KEMSA are preparing to steal this money for schools. To them, it is a business. Let me tell you, January was a very safe timing. One, the world will have known sufficient about this corona, even how to live with it. Two, there would have been sufficient interventions. The world is working around the clock to come up with a vaccine and other interventions. January is a safe bet. In case there is going to be a second wave, we would have gone through it. Trying to hurry schools today. Some schools have even closed and they may not be reopened, private schools. They are not even there. Teachers have left because they are not being paid. When you open schools, the schools will take time looking for those teachers. When they don't report, take time looking for other teachers, my friend. And finally, Abu Bakari, when you open schools, you can imagine the mobilization. You can imagine the traffic. Have you ever traveled in this country when schools are opening? What do you see in Nakuru? What do you see in Kisumu? What do you see in Machakos bus station?
Haman, yes, I have. I bet I was a student some times back, and I'm still a student of life.
Nonetheless, Haman, that kind of traffic.
Nonetheless, Haman, you say that people, and I still insist on the question of people pushing the ministry. The cabinet secretary today in a press conference said he is not the education cabinet secretary for public schools only. He is the education cabinet secretary for the education sector in the country.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. There are people who want schools to reopen. There are people who have an interest in it. I have put it very simple. I like speaking simple English. Not that I can't speak any other English. Let me put it very simple. Mago was talking about some English. Let me also tell him. There are people whose children have been prepared for exams. They want to rush poor Kenyans' children to school and subject them to an exam around March, April. You know, a human being is not a machine you switch off and on. Children have been home for almost 6-7 months. To get them psychologically back to school is not a joke. You'll take time to get the orientation back. And during which time you want to give them an exam. They are competing against children of the rich. Not very rich though. Rich have taken their kids out of the school, out of the country, or in very top-notch private schools. But those who are doing well, their children are learning as we speak. The children of a poor person in Luombe, where I come from, they are not learning. They can't afford it.
All right, Haman.
You want to give them an exam in 2-3 months.
Point made, Haman. Let me bring Mheshimiwa to the discussion. Is it a hurried decision to relook at the calendar?
Let me speak both as a parent and a legislature, because I run a constituency where I know the level of preparedness or the lack of it. As a parent, if you ask me, and I speak, I believe, for a lot of parents, this year was already a lost year. Psychologically, emotionally, financially, we adjusted. And everybody was waiting to take back their children to school next year. So for us to be able to go back and convince them that we are now ready, when the numbers that we are seeing according to international standards and science is that the curve ought to have flattened for consistent 14 days below 5 positivity rate. We haven't seen that. So based on that, number one, I would tell you that I think it is rushed. I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you from the little that I know that this is rushed. Number two, how prepared are we in terms of the infrastructure? You just saw the president the other day walking, supervising himself, how we are making desks. Those are things that we ought to do in terms of, do we have enough desks to assure our students of social distancing? That's the reason the president was walking in those workshops. I know in my constituency that we have reallocated monies that ought to have gone into other things so that we can provide for more desks. I know that I have reallocated money so that we can provide for 24 new classrooms that I estimate would be able to be built between now and January. So when you say that you're rushing to take children back to school in the month of October, in less than 1 month, we ought to be told, one, how much additional classrooms have been prepared in which schools, how much additional desks have been put in place, and where. Give us the distribution. Are the teachers well equipped to be able to handle the students? My son is in a boarding primary school. Are they going to be able to take care of this kid and the many kids in that school to the satisfaction of the parents, so that the panic that Haman is talking about, when 1 or 2 infections hit the boarding school, will I have to drive from Nairobi to Nakuru in a rush, in a panic, to go and pick my son? Will parents have to do that? I think the answer is no. I think what is happening here is that we are trying to prioritize livelihood of lives. And it is understandable that there are lots of people who depend in the education sectors, teachers in private schools. In my own constituency have people you call up-bet school teachers. These are alternative basic education training. Informal schools in informal settlements that are neither public nor private. And I have extreme sympathy for them because they are neither paid by the school boards nor by TAC, and they have totally been out of some kind of livelihoods. These people are suffering. But I think this is what the government ought to have done with our COVID money. There is money that Parliament put aside, 3 billion, that ought to have gone. We had emergency money and other things in terms of the supplementary budget that we are realigned here and there as Parliament. Those things should have been put in place so that we try and cushion the very same people for whom we are being rushed to go back to school.
All right, Mheshimiwa, point made. You also raise questions in as far as the reopening of schools is concerned. Let's get to the final and the third topic of our discussion tonight, which is to what some say is an already decided push for a referendum to amend Kenya's 2010 constitution. And the entry point to this discussion is perhaps to quote what the president said during the Madaraka Day speech. He said, and I quote, 10 years later, I am already discerning a constitutional moment, not a moment to replace the 2010 constitution, but one to improve on it, a moment that will right the wrongs that we did in 2010. First, is this the clearest of indication from the president, the head of the executive arm of the government, the party leader of the Jubilee Party, that perhaps and just perhaps a referendum is impending?
Who takes first?
Haman, go ahead.
Haman, you.
Yes, that's a very good indication. Madaraka Day is a serious national day, and things that the president says on such occasions are taken seriously, and therefore is a very good indication. Something else the president has said, he has talked about this winner take all, which you can only address through a referendum. And finally, you ask whether really it will happen. Yes, indeed it will happen, because when you have the leader of the opposition and the leader, head of government and head of state teaming up to push for something, surely it will take place. The question can only be, will it go through? But whether or not we shall have a referendum, that's obvious. As to whether we have a constitutional moment, that is debatable. And you don't even need a constitutional moment. The Constitution envisages that it can be changed. Those who are saying it is too early, maybe because they do not have sufficient information. The American Constitution was changed, I think, 10, 12 times within the first 2-3 years. You get it? Very serious amendments. You put a law in place so that it can help you navigate yourself.
And Haman,
propel yourself.
And Haman, there is a
space.
question. There is a question on that. You say you put the law in place, which begs the question: is the review, the amendments of the interest of the people then, or the politicians, the leaders who are pushing for this referendum? Let Mheshimiwa answer that question, Anthony.
Could you take the question again?
I'm asking if then, as Haman says, there's a need to review the constitution. Is that review in the interest of people or the leaders only?
I think to ask that question is to question the very constitution itself. If the framers of the constitution did not anticipate that it should be touched or tampered with, they clearly would have done away with Article 257 of the Constitution. They probably also would have tampered with Article 1 that talks about the sovereign right of the people. But in exercise of that sovereign right, Article 257 was placed there, so that whenever it is people feel that the Constitution has reached a point where it has the kind of tensions or things that need to be unlocked, as I see now, then they can go back and say that, exercising that power, we want to do this or we want to do that. So there will always be argument, and I call them distractions, as to for whose benefit is it being amended, or this is being amended so that you can have advantage for some people for 2022 2022, and I can see your subtitle is 2022 and BBI. There are those who are talking about dynasty and perpetuating dynasties. But
how is it a distraction? How is it a distraction? Is it not a genuine question to ask of whose interest the Constitution should or even is being amended?
Let me tell you this. If gay people existed in Kenya and they said that they wanted to amend the Constitution by popular initiatives, it would be their right to come up with a referendum question and let the people debate and decide that this is not according to our moral fabric or it isn't, it is to our benefit or it isn't, it is Western importation into our country or it isn't. I would like that we engage into why do we want to, the debate into why do we want to change it, which clauses do we see. I see, for example, the Constitution in terms of our governance. We wanted a parliamentary system that gave us the more flexibility in terms of oversight. Government that would be in parliament that we would put to account, not members of cabinet who feel like some small demigods that you cannot summon and put them to account when you're voting and giving to them 82% of the budget that you pass every year. Unlocking constitutional impasses and tensions such as the one that was thrown to us under Article 81B, the two-thirds gender rule. Clearly, those things need a constitutional initiative to try and unlock that. And I know that the two-thirds, the BBI has those things in place. So I would like to engage into a debate on why are we, what are the issues in the Constitution. Let's talk about these issues. And one of the most important things, we just finished a debate on the revenue for sharing formula. And therefore, putting more counties, money to the counties is one of the key things that we want to achieve with BBI, putting it to 35, perhaps even 45%.
Mheshimiwa, it looks as though you have already decided. It looks as though you have already decided on which way this can be rectified. You are citing the BBI in your response.
I would rather engage in the content of the debate than the sideshows. You know, my professor, PLO Lumumba, my PLO professor for law, used to tell me, you say that, you know, sometimes you lose sight of the antelope by looking at the hair of some sungura that is passing along somewhere. So let's not lose focus of the antelope just because we have seen some sideshows and distractions along the way. Let's discuss the content. Let's fail or rise to the occasion to amend this constitution because we don't want more money to go to the counties. Let's fail and or pass this constitution because we have argued the merits of the current presidential system vis-a-vis a parliamentary one. Let's look at the two-thirds and decide, do we want to go the German way of mixed proportional representation, the way they also do in South Africa? Let's look at the merits. I want more money to be given to the county as conditional grants so that we can have more youth, sports stadium, ICT, things that can bring youth employment and empowerment to the counties. Let's give them more money, but as conditional grants. There are many things we can do in terms of discussing the content. Where can we enrich this constitution instead of to whose benefit is this being amended?
Well, it's a question that many Kenyans will still need an answer for, whether it is in their genuine interest. Nonetheless, Herman, then the question of when comes. There are those proponents who argue that amend the constitution if at all you want to, but amend it at the same time as the elections will be come 2022. Is it an idea you buy?
Anyways, okay, in many countries, there are many referendum questions all the time, and they are put together with an election. You wouldn't even know there was a referendum. That's one way of looking at it. But in this particular case, I very much doubt. Some of the things, one of the key things they want to address is do with the electoral problems, beginning with 2022. You must do certain things in the lead up to the 2022 election. So you cannot wait to have the referendum and make the changes in 2022 when the same changes are supposed to be used to right the wrongs about the election 2022. So it goes without saying that for this referendum to make sense, then it has to come before 2022. That means the referendum must be held within perhaps next year.
Before 2022, again, rises the question of cost and the much involved in as far as catering for that is concerned. For instance, the IEBC chairperson, Wafula Chebukati, and this is my final question, says, quote, as to the issue of how much we are informed by the cost of the repeat presidential election of October 26, 2017, which cost 12 billion shillings. 12 billion is too much, isn't it?
Those are jokers. Those are jokers. You see, look here. You live
This is the
country.
chairperson of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. He's not a joker.
Yes, and I am saying he's a joker because we live in this country. You know how much money people make during elections. I agree with Raila Odinga that our elections need not be as expensive as they are, to the extent of being almost the most expensive elections in the world. Look here. These things are known. We exaggerate everything. We use millions where thousands would have sufficed. The truth is, our election is one of the most expensive. And in fact, going forward, a referendum is something can be done in a very simple way. I agree with Raila. 2 billion, 3 billion at most. Well, because we are used to stealing here and there, maybe 5 billion, 4, 3, 4, but not 12 billion. What do you need 12 billion for? To do what? He's talking about hiring vehicles, he's doing about what? All these are just jokes. And Abubakari, we must embrace technology. We cannot continue to spend billions of money when we are poor, when half the population goes to bed hungry, when we have over 10 million young people unemployed in a population of 50 million. And yet proceed to spend billions of shillings on an election. Any election, whether a referendum or whatever election. Have you seen how much a by-election costs in this country? You are left wondering. I've always argued, we don't need by-elections. We need to have a law in place which says there's a way of filling a seat in the event the occupier vacates that office through death or whatever it is.
All right, Aman, I understand.
I saw the draft constitution. Yeah.
Aman, I understand we are extremely out of time.
It need not be expensive as people are making it.
All right, same question still on the cost, Mheshimiwa Anthony Oluoch, as we end the discussion. Your thoughts on the same?
Well, cost is something that can be argued, and I think I agree with Professor Haman that the cost of our elections have been exaggerated and perhaps have been made a business in itself. I think it is a lucrative business for people in IEBC, and it is something that maybe as Parliament we have failed to do. We ought to have carried an independent audit, study of other jurisdictions on how expensive or cheap an election should be, so that we ought to have parameters. Where we spend 10 billion, is it possible that we could spend 2 or 3 or 5 billion? That is something that we ought to have done. But nevertheless, even if it was 10 billion, for purposes of the Constitution and what we want to achieve, we have been able to spend 10 billion. We have been able to lose through corruption. I think 30% of our budget every year is lost to corruption. That runs into billions of shillings. So for purposes of bringing together our governance to a level where we are having more money to devolution, achieving 2/3, achieving inclusivity and other things, I think 10 billion is really small money comparatively.
All right, and that's where we will have to end this discussion. Anthony Oluoch, Mathare Lawmaker, and Herman Manyora, our resident analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, for making time for us tonight on TV 47.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
All right, let me go through some of your feedback. Patrick Nyangs on Facebook says, shall or will? Well, the Constitution says shall. Jonathan Gitonga says he must dissolve it. President has disobeyed many court orders. They want to rule by non-existent BBI talk. Deco Dayman says scandals after scandals. I agree. That is a comment. It's not that I'm agreeing anyway. Kebene Emmanuel says, I'm wondering they are constructing some desks without building classrooms, the avenue for COVID billionaires. Jonathan Gitonga says, we can't beg if you have stolen 49 billion. Joseph Maina Chege says, serious constitutional questions that subsequently arise from the advisory of the Chief Justice. Those are but some of your feedback. That brings us to the end of tonight's edition of Pundits Night. On behalf of the entire team that made this production possible, bye for now. Enjoy the rest of our programs. We value your feedback, welcome any comments, queries or complaints regarding our programming content. You can get in touch with us on 0768095491 or send us a message on 22047. You can also send